I had tachycardia, rapid heart rate, about 130 BPM every second of every day at one point. Even when lying down. Lying down, it would get the lowest. It would get to about 110, which is still fast, still too fast, but then I would have blood pressure swings so much, so my heart would start pounding if I started to get up, and it genuinely felt like it was hard to breathe because of my ribs. I couldn't go to sleep because my ribs would sink in so much during sleep that it would wake me up. Like I was like gasping for air. And so I would spend nights where one night I was up for 40 hours because I could not go to sleep. I was exhausted, but I couldn't go to sleep. And that's just, I mean, that is a form of torture. Like you can employ that as a torture method on someone.
Welcome to the Recovery and Transformation Podcast, the show that links personal health with societal well-being. I'm your host, Samir Dosani. I'm an activist, a PhD student, and a health coach based out of Johannesburg, South Africa. This show explores the root causes of disease and talks about how people are recovering and transforming every day. Hi, and welcome to another episode. My guest today is Eddie Goki. Eddie is a young man of 21 who writes books on science and health and has his own YouTube channel. Eddie has a remarkable story about a very rare disease, hypermobile EDS, a disease which, as we learn in this interview, nearly killed him. Through a number of interventions, including a carnivore diet, he's been able to make substantial gains and is nearly recovered. Eddie has also become an expert in his own right on the carnivore diet and various elements of microbiology. Part of Eddie's story that we don't really get into here is a nutraceutical that Eddie credits with helping him produce enough adult stem cells to get him on the path to recovery. Now, I've also started using this product and have found significant improvements, especially with my vitiligo autoimmune condition. If you're interested in learning more, check out samir.sarule.com. That's Samir, my first name, .cerule.com. With that, please enjoy my interview with Eddie Goki. Eddie Goki, it's a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, man.
So your stuff has been blowing up on YouTube for a little while now. I'm glad that I finally got a chance to track you down. Tell me a little bit. I think most people would be familiar with your story, the longer version of your story that you told on Dave Mack's channel. But just tell us a little bit. How did you come to this space?
Yeah, so it started whenever I was 16. I had some significant symptoms of something that was very arcane. No one really knew what was going on. There were things like anxiety attacks, things like POTS symptoms that I hadn't, felt before, experienced before. And then most significantly, I had extreme pain when experiencing any emotion, whether it be positive or negative, and whether it be subtle or extreme. And it fully debilitated me, despite me trying to go to work with all of those symptoms. I just basically ran myself into the dirt.
And can I pause you there for a second, Eddie?
Yeah.
So when you tell like mainstream doctors that whenever you have an emotion, you're experiencing physical pain, what was their response?
Well, their response was basically to tell me that it was all in my head. It wasn't basically, it was literally, that's what they said. They said that whether it be explicitly saying that or whether they said something or asked me questions like, oh, does your family have a history of anxiety or any disorder like that? And you know what they're saying when they say that. That's what I was told by everyone that I went to. They didn't seem to grasp that it was an actual physical pain that I was feeling when I experienced an emotion, not some physical response like an increased heart rate that I was experiencing from thinking something. That wasn't happening. It was the opposite, where I was experiencing the pain first, which would cause me to be afraid. It was, and then it was a feedback loop. So no matter who I went to, they did not seem to understand it. And just a side note, I just recently had a comment on one of my videos from someone, or rather, no, one of the interviews I did, I think it was with Dave Mack. I was looking at the comments and someone had actually said, it was the first time I've ever seen someone share that experience. They told me that they had rib issues as well, that's where it came from with me. I had, I'll get into it in just a second, but they had rib issues that caused the very same thing. If they put pressure on their ribs, that would actually cause the symptoms to flare up more. And they were like, well, why is my anxiety getting worse when I'm lifting something up? And it's like, well, it's not really anxiety related per se. So I have now seen someone express the same symptoms. So it's quite rare, but it is a real thing. But whenever I was looking into it throughout, for 2 years straight, what was going on with me, I was experimenting with diet. I sort of was driven to that sphere because I didn't know what else to fix or to tamper with. And so, with that being said, I did start with just basic, this is healthy and this is not healthy. The basic stuff that I was taught, like these are plants and those are healthy, cut down on the fat and cut down on the meat. You know, I ate lean meat in the form of chicken breast and I maybe had one of those a day. But the rest of it was things like spinach and broccoli and kidney beans and black beans and canned tomato. Like it was just a lot of vegetable content. That didn't seem to help at all whatsoever with my symptoms. Then I sort of I transgressed. I came across Dr. Stephen Gundry, which many people have heard of before. He's one of those people that I've had on my channel. I've critiqued on my channel before, but he's one of those people that no matter I think he has genuine good intentions with what he's teaching. So I never will have those like really ill feelings towards Dr. Gundry, I don't think. But he was one of the first people to teach me about plants and like the toxicity in plants, or at least some of them in his ideology. So you've got lectins primarily with him. And so I was, I was open, I was introduced to them and then I cut those out. At least I followed what he said to cut out in terms of their lectin content versus others, and I felt better. I will not lie, I felt better. Um, who's to say that's attributed to actual lectin content in foods being eliminated, or whether it was due to different food choices altogether? Like I was eating more pastured beef and eggs, for example, that I wasn't doing before. So who's to say? Um, and then I came across Dave Asprey. Many people have heard of him as well. And he was on a similar, at the time, Dr. Gundry train, except he said that you should prioritize more animal protein than Dr. Gundry says to do. So I actually did that. And I started, you know, basically upping the ground beef that I was eating, pastured, grass fed ground beef, and same thing with eggs, like 4 eggs a day I was eating, and a pound of ground beef a day with all the other stuff as well, though. During that same time, I went to Florida, to a clinic, Caring Medical Florida, to start having treatment administered to me. First, to get diagnosed with my EDS. That's what I have. I have hypermobile EDS. It's basically just characterized as instability of my ligaments, which are what hold bone to bone. So my body's really loose, to put it really simply. It's really loose, and those ligaments don't really do their job as well as they should. And I was diagnosed there, and then they administer treatments that are regenerative. I will make a full recovery eventually, but during that time, I still continue my diet transition journey, sort of. Um, when I got to Florida, I was still doing Gundry. Then I started to do Dave Asprey style, upping animal protein, and then came across Paul.
Asprey's the bulletproof guy, right?
Yep, yep. And then um, after Dave came Paul Saladino, which seems to be that's like the first. It's a canon event with most people. You have to go through Paul Saladino first, and I did that diet for about a month, and I did not feel good on that diet at all. Actually, at the very least felt the same as I did with the others, but actually it was just arguably worse. I started having breakouts all over my forehead and face whenever I would eat. Um, and then I would have sweats after I would sweat after I ate, which people colloquially deem the meat sweats, and we know now that it's not what you get when you only eat meat. So there's got to be something else to it. I think it's when you eat both at the same time, carbs and fats. That's what happens to me. Um, and then blood pressure would go up after I ate, and a lot of problems, just a lot of issues. And then I came across Bart K after that. And it was because he was reacting to a video of Paul's that I had watched of Paul's the previous day. And I was like, oh, this guy's actually pretty small YouTuber, at the time at 30,000 subs, I think, at the time of me discovering his channel. And he had freshly deleted all of his videos and then started uploading again. So I guess, YouTube was like, hey, you might like this. And I didn't like it at first. I hated it, because I venerated Paul in my head. I held him to such a high standard, and I was like, who is this person to say that? And then I read at the bottom screen that it said professor of health science, and it said a lot of other things. He lists what he is, and I was like, wait, is he? Like, actually? And then I looked into it, and he is. And so then I was like, okay. Well, I watched the whole video, then watched more, and I was like, oh, I have to, I have to exhibit some humility here. I think he's probably he sounds more sensible in the first place. So I started carnivore about, well, actually pretty much immediately, but with a sweet potato on the side, for about a week or two, and then I eliminated that. And so I've been carnivore since then. First, it was more strict with red meat and eggs, and then I slowly started to introduce a little bit of dairy after about a year, of doing strict carnivore. And then I did tamper around. I did experiment with some of the more processed meats like pepperoni and salami and stuff like that. But I don't do that anymore. I'm pretty strict still. I'll have some dairy here and there, and I will have some carnivore carbs like once a week with like heavy cream or something, but it's really low. It's like under 20 grams still every
Yeah.
week. Yeah.
Cool. And if you compare, I think because your story is slightly different, it's not like you, some of the stories we tell on this channel and on other channels are like, I went carnivore and my life changed. Your life
Hmm.
had already changed. You already found some diet. It sounds like the low carb, meat heavy diets, not Saladino. Saladino is a different thing. But it sounds like that and carnivore was for you. They were both about the similar amounts of therapeutic benefit. Do you think that's right? Or you think you're getting more with being stricter carnivore than you were even with low carb ketovore, whatever that was?
I've noticed from my experience, I'm getting a lot more benefit from being completely, no carbohydrate, basically, unless I have 20 grams on one day throughout the week. So really low carb carnivore. And it was actually more apparent, not when I made that change to that diet, it was more apparent when I would transgress after doing it for a year. That's whenever I really know, because I was like, I'm doing this for health reasons. I'm trying to bolster the effectiveness of my treatments that I'm, getting administered to me, that I'm receiving. Um, so I want to remain strict. And when you're in a lot of pain, it's really easy to stay strict. Everyone will tell you that in the space. It's really easy to transgress a lot whenever you don't experience pain, that often when you do such a thing. It's only whenever you get sick that that you start to, you know, really understand that you need to be strict, or else you will experience that pain. And that's sort of how it was throughout that year. I was so adamant that I believed so strongly in the fact that this was the way to eat that I never transgressed. It was only until I started to get better with treatments that I was like, oh, well, what would happen? I think it was my subconscious brain telling me, oh, okay, I bet you can start to, eat just a little bit of this or that and get away with it. And no, I couldn't actually. I could with still carnivorous foods, like I could with some dairy. I didn't have like pain happen. I had some bloat happen that did absolutely occur, but it wasn't pain that I had. Um, Pepperoni itself, actually, they have spices in pepperoni. Those would flare me up a little bit when I started having those. And it
Yeah,
was, yeah,
those spices would probably be nightshades if you think about it.
yep,
So that makes some sense.
yep,
Um, so one thing I just want to highlight in your story, Eddie, is it didn't come out so much, but would you say this was this illness that we'll get into in a little bit more detail in a second? If I understand correctly, at a certain point it was life threatening. Like at a certain point, you were actually thinking about death fairly regularly. Is that correct?
yes, it was a 24/7 thing. It's really the reason that was the case was because, I mean, to try and explain to someone how loose I actually felt when they don't have the condition is really difficult. I mean, we take for granted the stability or the structural stability of our body. But my ligaments were so you could see them on the X-rays that they did in the scans. They were actually really thin, so they were like really small, and therefore they don't do their job that well. And if I moved my arm, there was movement. I mean, gravity itself would be enough of a force to cause shifting if I lifted my arm up. And it still will happen in my upper body. Even just then, I had a little crack, but so I am still dealing with this condition, and I will be for quite some time. But it wasn't just that. The structural stability itself caused me and caused my vascular system to be disrupted in terms of its normal flow. Um, I had tachycardia, rapid heart rate, about 130 BPM every second of every day at one point. Even when lying down. Lying down, it would get the lowest. It would get to about 110, which is still fast, still too fast, but then I would have blood pressure swings so much, so my heart would start pounding if I started to get up, and it genuinely felt like it was hard to breathe because of my ribs. I couldn't go to sleep because my ribs would sink in so much during sleep that it would wake me up. Like I was like gasping for air. And so I would spend nights where one night I was up for 40 hours because I could not go to sleep. I was exhausted, but I couldn't go to sleep. And that's just, I mean, that is a form of torture. Like you can employ that as a torture method on someone. You know,
People do, yeah.
yeah, exactly. And so it was like I was being tortured by my own body. I went to the hospital that day or that night, and they gave me Ativan. Um, Also told me that my chiropractor at the time that told me that I have a structural condition very clearly, who was taking my stomach out from underneath my chest cavity and trying to get it back into position. It was that bad. My ribs were that unstable. Um, they told me that he was basically a quack. It was voodoo science, what he told me. Well, they're looking at me in my face and telling me this while they're administering Ativan into my veins. And then they're saying, you are just dehydrated. Yeah, that's what they told me at the hospital. After they sent me home, I actually almost didn't get to sleep still. With Ativan and with 42 hours at that point of no sleep, um, I almost didn't get to sleep. I was still gasping for breath, but the drug did eventually. I slept for like 13 hours, but I was living this type of life every single day. I couldn't walk. I couldn't eat, or couldn't make food myself. And so I was staring up at the ceiling, lying down on the floor. Couldn't lie down on my bed even because that was too much give. My body would sink in too much. I had to be on the floor, and I was just staring up at the ceiling at 18 years old at this point. Like, am I going to die? Like I was basically waiting for death, you know? And so it was really difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, heavy stuff, man. So just because um, you appear very young, but you speak with a level of emotional and intellectual maturity that belies your age. So just remind the listeners and the viewers, how old are you right now?
I am just now 21. I turned 21 2 weeks ago. Yeah.
Okay, happy birthday, belated. Cool.
Thanks.
Okay, so in this story, what is the vagus nerve, and what does it have to do with your story here?
Yeah, so the vagus nerve, you have two of them. There's one that runs on the right side of your body and the left one. The left one is typically seen as the more important one because it stems through the vascular system more as opposed to simply the digestive tract like the right one does. Vagus is Latin for wandering, which tells you what the nerve really, its significance. It wanders throughout the entire body. It stems the entire body. And it is a regulator of your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. It's basically the foundation of your I think it's, if I'm getting them right, parasympathetic is the calming, relaxing one. The sympathetic
100%.
is, yeah, fight or flight. So it runs through your whole body, and it's the foundation of your parasympathetic nervous system. You can think of it as. And the thing with my condition, with the ligament laxity, was that since that nerve regulates heart rate and it regulates blood pressure, for example, those my bones that are supposed to be stable, they were actually impinging on those nerves. They were impinging on the vagus nerves. And at first, that'll already cause issues. That can actually cause your brain wave activities to sort of be in a more of a fight or flight situation, so to speak, or in at that activity. And so that alone, even if you're not feeling anything physical, that can also cause you to feel differently. And that's actually kind of how I felt in the beginning before it got extremely severe. It just felt I just felt off. I felt butterflies in my stomach when I shouldn't. Like I was just my brain was having anxiety for no reason. So sort of like I knew it was physical because there's it was just out of nowhere. I was like, everything's fine. I don't know what's going on. Um, but for a while, that'll remain just a simple impingement. But if it has no time to relax and recover, rather is probably the better word, then it doesn't just remain an impingement. It remains. It starts to turn into degeneration. So you'll actually have a degeneration of the nerves, and that'll cause a slew of issues. This was the reason, or at least one of the main reasons, why I had such problems with my cardiovascular health. Despite lying down, I would still have the issues. But the reason why positioning mattered was because all of those ligaments, whenever I would get up, gravity would impose a force on me, and I would collapse in a way, and the bones would, even if it's slight by a few millimeters, they would move too much, and it would cause the nerve to be impinged upon, and it would cause other nerves in my neck that are really important, like my phrenic nerves that are important for diaphragmatic contractions and stuff. So that also affected my heart rate and everything like that, and blood pressure. Um, but yeah, even when I went to the clinic, for example, um, they actually will measure the diameter of your vagus nerve, and they saw that it was much smaller, like really small in diameter, and that was for both of them, but primarily my left one, especially my left one, and that's the one that is seen to, or is deemed to be the one that's extremely important, or more important than the other one in regulating things like heart rate and the vascular system as a whole in terms of how it functions. So a lot of people, yeah. Anyway, to focus more on the vagus nerve situation and how it can lead to degeneration if it's impinged upon or something, if people have a problem with it. Um, a lot of people may think that the vagus nerves or any neuropathy or something like that can be exclusively diet related or something like that, but it can also be structurally related. If you have an injury, for example, like a car wreck, even can actually cause that to happen because it'll cause shifting in your. I mean, it can cause whiplash in your neck, and that can cause extreme issues. Um, and that actually was seen in my X-rays. Everyone that asked me when they did an X-ray on my neck, for example, they said, were you in a car accident? Every single person. And I was like, no, that's how my neck is. And so that was, anyway. Yeah. So
I
Vegas.
mean, just as an aside, the doctors are seeing these X-rays and they're still telling you it's psychosomatic. Basically, I mean, that's
Yeah.
negligent. That's
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. They were telling me that it was a separate issue. They would say, oh yeah, you have problems with your neck, but the anxiety issue is totally different. And so it was like,
Yeah, I
okay.
just want to highlight this for a second, Eddie, because it's like when you learn this. Listen, I haven't been to med school, but when you look at the medical textboots, you learn about the different systems, right? You learn about the skeletal system. You learn about the nervous system, the CNS, central nervous system, and as you said, it's two components: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system, etc. And I think what you're telling us is that these are actually, I mean, I think people know this intellectually, but doctors don't think this way.
Hmm.
That a problem in one system can actually affect other systems too.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they don't. I don't think they think of the body as one uni system, so to speak. It's like it's an entire system working in tandem with all the mini systems you could think of it as in the entire body. So you have a wrench in one system. It's going to throw a wrench. It's going to stem to all. It's going to it's going to spread to all the others. So yeah.
That's super important to understand. And I think there are certain like there's certain fundamentals of that system that I mean I think because it is a holistic system, so I think if people with different specialties will see it differently, they'll see it through the lens
Hmm.
of that specialty. But I think for me as a generalist, like I think the vagus nerve is actually a really important starting point to understand a lot of this stuff.
Yeah,
Does that make
no, I
sense?
agree. Yeah.
Okay. All right, cool. So, sorry, you hadn't finished telling us about that dynamic between the vagus nerve and your condition, or had you?
No, yeah. So, I mean, there were other issues as well. The vagus nerve is responsible for controlling things like swallowing as well. The way your eyes work, like the dilation of your pupils, for example. I had problems with those as well. If people would shine a light in my eyes, your pupils are supposed to constrict, and one would, but the other would sort of, and then it would oscillate between dilated and constricted, dilated, constricted. Fortunately, mine don't do that anymore. We've made enough progress to the point where that doesn't happen, but it would. We I don't think I have the video anymore, or else I would probably show it to other people. But I definitely would. But we had a video where someone would just turn the flash on and they put it in my eyes, and you could see the pupils not dilating properly, or at least constricting properly. The other thing was I would have these esophageal spasms, and this is something that I actually still do have, but that's because my ribs are not fully solidified yet. They're not fully healed yet. That was the most significant part of my condition. So I've had probably a dozen treatments on the front and back of my ribs combined, like so the thoracic spine, the corresponding areas, and they're still not fully fixed. They can still move, but
Wow.
I still have those, but it's subsided significantly because I believe this because those nerves have regenerated quite a bit. I mean, I would be talking to someone like I'm talking to you, and then
Yeah.
it would look like I just gagged mid sentence, mid word, but I didn't gag. It was a neurological. It was being impinged on, so it would send a signal when it shouldn't have to the throat to sort of have a spasm, the esophagus to have a spasm. So I had that as well. Um, Honestly, the amount of symptoms I had, the sheer amount of symptoms, they're listed extensively in. I'm sure many of you viewers may know that I have a book out. I made sure to put all of the details, since my story is so long, all of the symptoms that I had. I made an entire Google Doc like list of them. I made sure to put them in the epilogue of my book because I can't remember all of them. I mean, fortunately, I can't remember all of them because that means I'm not experiencing them anymore, but yeah, there were a lot more that were related to the vagus nerve. If people want a better breakdown of it that I could ever give, I would actually refer to the clinic's YouTube page because they have seminars on this. Like vagus, I think it's the doctor there, Dr. Ross Hauser. He refers to it as vagopathy, basically, and he has whole seminars on like what that can cause and all that. And I think that that's a good starting point. That's where I started when I learned about it, actually. So.
Fascinating stuff. Tell me a little bit about the therapy that you're getting in Florida. What is that? What are they doing to you exactly? What does it look like?
Yeah, so many people have heard of it before. They may have heard of one of them, PRP. That's sort of talked about in the space, somewhat. And then there's prolotherapy, which is sort of an adjacent. Prolotherapy is the first treatment that they typically start with at the clinic because it's cheaper, and also there's no need to go to the more effective and invasive one if the first one will work, if the cheaper one especially will work. Prolotherapy is simply a solution, or rather, the therapy itself it involves administering a solution in between the bones, in directly onto the ligaments in the body, in order to effectuate an inflammatory healing response. It basically uses and utilizes the innate inflammatory healing properties of the body to repair a ligament. So you can use it for injuries if you've actually injured the ligament, or you can use it for people that naturally have really thin ligaments to build them up. So it's basically like going through a second developmental process. And so what the solution is, though, is it's very simple. It's water, dextrose, sugar, a plant compound that promotes inflammation in the area. Leave it to plants to do that, right? And then you've got, I think there's a slight numbing agent in it as the fourth one. But the first three are the most significant ones. And what they do is, once again, they administer it in between the bones at the injured or just loose site, and they'll inject it there. And over time, it'll immediately cause an inflammatory response. I mean, this is not I don't like to sugarcoat things. I'm not trying to discourage people from undergoing this treatment if they genuinely think they need it. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is not a friendly. It is not a light experience. It's painful.
It's not pleasant. It's quite painful. If you hadn't been through much worse pain, it would suck even worse than it probably sucks right now.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean they offer things like you can get Xanax or like administered to you during it to help with it, and nitrous as a level below that, so to speak. But that is that it's still going to be painful, but it will immediately cause an inflammatory response to the ligament, and then over the course of about 2 weeks, it will slowly heal up even more. It will start to rebuild. It's basically the body doing it itself. It's rebuilding the structure of the ligament. Now, why the question that many people have or may have is, why do you have to do that? Why aren't the ligaments just doing that themselves? Like, why is the body already doing that with the ligaments themselves? Well, it's simply put, it's because ligaments, when you think of ligaments, they're very white. They have very poor blood supply. They're not like muscles where they have a significant amount of blood supply, um, which is one of the reasons why they're red. One of them, but therefore, in order to actually cause the body to recognize, hey, there is an injury here, like that absolutely needs to be repaired, you have to give the stimulus that the body is not actually receiving already from other parts of the body to effectuate that response. And the needle itself, a lot of people don't know that the solution helps with that, sugar and water, and then the plant compound that actually will promote inflammation to that targeted area. That will cause an inflammatory response, but the needle itself will as well. I mean, even if there were no solution, poking the ligament with a needle can already start the process of repair. A lot of people don't know that. So that is prolotherapy. In my experience, I mean, it saved my life. It's not like a placebo. I couldn't just like receive that treatment and then get up and be like, oh, I'm fine now. Like, no, I went through this I've gone through this for years now. I haven't had a treatment in a few months. Um, but every single time I get treatment, and everyone around me can see it too, so they can vouch for me on this, I get better every single time. It absolutely does work. Now, here's the thing, though. I don't just get prolotherapy. I also get the stronger one, which is PRP. PRP is the exact same, except The solution is different. It's not dextrose and water. What they do is they take your blood and then they concentrate the healing elements out of it. I mean, PRP stands for platelet rich plasma. So they're taking yeah, and they're taking your blood and concentrating a certain amount of the blood out of it, or the parts of the blood that they want out of it. And then they do it by spinning it twice. Then they concentrate it into the syringes, and then they'll use that instead on your ligaments. And in my experience, that has actually been even more effective. It hurts more, but it is slightly more effective. And
So basically, you're getting an injection of your own white blood cells. Is that more or less correct?
effectively, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, it's more of your body
Yeah.
that is doing the healing as well. So as opposed to prolotherapy. Not to say that prolotherapy doesn't work. I mean, in my experience, it does work, and I get both. Every treatment, I get both. So because they can only take so much blood, so they use prolotherapy and they use platelet-rich plasma on me. But the thing is I think if I could add one final note about PRP, a lot of people I think they think of PRP as not as effective as I've experienced it to be. And I think one of the reasons why is because when people do like studies on it, which it's sort of an incipient area of science still, um, when people do studies on it, what they'll do is they'll administer like one or two injections into an area. And for example, I've gotten this treatment done for years now, and I'm still not completely done. And that's with me getting over 100 every appointment administered. So I mean, it's effective, but you have to administer enough, I think, in one go. And maybe that's just me in my individual case. They did tell me that I was one of the top. They see thousands of tens of thousands probably throughout their entire lifespan. That they've seen so many patients, but I'm one of the top 10% is what they said of their cases in terms of my case. So it could just be me.
Sorry, when you say it's one of the top 10%, you mean you had the most serious symptoms or you had the best response? What does that mean exactly?
Top 10% in terms of my symptoms, yes, and in terms of my presentation, really, whenever they looked at my scans. The doctor there said to me that they have in every room, they have a huge, like, TV screen, and they can show your DMX, which digital motion X-ray, so it's just an X-ray, but it's moving, so they can which is important when you're trying to look for instability like that, extremely important. They said that they were showing me all my scans, and they said, you might not know what this looks like. You probably don't know the significance of this. I'm just trying to show you, to be more personal with our discussion here. But if you were to put it, really bluntly, if you would come any later, you were on your way for something catastrophic, is what he told me. And we all know what that means. It's sort of deliberately inoffensive anodyne talk for you were on your way for death. Exactly what I knew was happening. So anyway, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So from what I can make out, your symptoms were among the worst I've ever seen, but you've had a good response to the therapy. Do you have
Yeah.
any idea about their statistics? Like how many people who get this therapy actually have a good response? I'm just asking because I imagine the fact that you're fairly young has something to do with the fact that you're responding pretty well. I imagine that at a certain age, maybe the effectiveness would be less, or is that not the case?
I don't think that's the case. I see so many people go there because whenever I'm in the waiting room, I'm one of the youngest people there every single time. Mostly it's people that are older because a lot of people will start to have joint issues when they're older and they think that prolotherapy will help them. And I have seen it, I don't know the statistics on it. I haven't looked into the statistics on it. But from every single person I've heard of that has actually gone to that clinic, received treatment, even just one time, whether that be online, whenever they report their experiences there, or whenever I hear it in person and see it in person, they say that it is life changing. It works. It absolutely does work. I haven't heard a story of it not working. I genuinely have not heard a story of it not working. And not only it's I think also it's just the amount of care that they employ when they do the treatments themselves. It's not very cursory either. It's very focused. They spend a very good amount of time on each individual patient. They make you feel, heard and listened to, the nurses and also the two doctors there that actually do the treatments. So I think that helps as well. I know that helps as well because I've experienced it there, you
Yeah.
know. But
Yeah.
yeah, I haven't heard of any negative side effects either. I haven't heard of any failures at all, like people reporting that it didn't work or actually made them worse. I have not heard of that or seen that personally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. I mean, I don't know much about these forms of therapy, but it's really fascinating to learn and to for some people, I think you really need that. In your case, it was life saving. So
Hmm.
so great stuff. Eddie, can we change gears for a little bit? I wanted to talk about. So I wanted to sort of pick your brain. Um, Looking at your channel and sort of binging watching your content as I did in preparation for this interview, I'm just struck by your almost encyclopedic knowledge of various forms of biochemistry and microbiology. And I want to sort of pick your brains around some of the more common bullshit that we get in this space, sort of pushback. Does that sound like a good, a fun 30 minutes or so?
Yeah, definitely, for sure.
So one of the things that we hear, so I'm trying to think of the standard pushback. So one of the things that we hear is that the carnivore diet with capital letters, although I think there are several carnivore diets, which is why I'm sort of,
Yep. Yep.
yeah, I'm being a little bit facetious that way. But what we hear is that it's going to be deficient in micronutrients and trace minerals, right?
Yeah.
And we have anecdotal evidence from some people. I even saw someone, was it Lily? What's her name? Lily Kane or
Lily
Lily Ann
Kane.
Kane?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's someone on her channel, an expert, who basically, she didn't say I have scurvy, but she was like my gums and blah blah blah, and she was thinking about introducing, I don't know, fruits and vegetables or something. So
Mm.
what's your pushback if someone says, oh, you're gonna get XYZ deficiency related syndrome?
Right. So that's an interesting one. I've actually been thinking about that the last 2 days, especially. I was just I ponder about this stuff a lot. So when it comes to establishing, for example, just to start off, when it comes to establishing what the required amount of a nutrient is for someone, you already are going to have difficulty doing that because every single person varies in terms of their needs, just depending on size, activity level, etc. So what scientists do, I mean, the people that establish RDAs, for example, they have to come up with sort of a normative level. Like, okay, well, this seems to be the appropriate amount given this context. However, it's already difficult to do that because all of the nutrients work in tandem with one another. And so really the best we have when it comes to RDAs and RDIs is the RDAs and RDIs that have already been established, which were, I think, if I haven't looked into it in a while, but from recollection, I think what they did is they found, once again, the normative level of like what is required, and then they inflated it just in case. Like they basically made them a lot larger than they were.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think that's what they did.
can I can
Um,
I can I come in on that a little bit?
yeah,
So because it varies from. I think the answer is that it varies from micronutrient to micronutrient, unfortunately. And
yeah,
what they often did, so in some cases, and I think vitamin C may be a case of this, they took a big cohort of a healthy population and sort of took an average, and that was it. And
yeah.
then other things, for example, um, what would be a good example of this? I think B12 may be a good example of this, but I think iron would also be a good example of this.
I think
They
magnesium.
looked
I think
they looked
magnesium.
at the level they looked at the level that was actually causing like insufficient levels. So you had people presenting with symptoms of vitamin B deficiency or iron deficiency, women especially in the latter case. And you could say, okay, at this level, this person has this level and she doesn't have symptoms. This person is slightly lower and she does have symptoms. So they would say, okay, this is the minimum needed to remove symptoms. I think protein requirements are also this story. And then, as you say, they inflated it like 10 or 15%, something like that. So, but the baseline was, it wasn't an average. It was worse than a population average. It was, this is when we start to clinically see symptoms, and maybe we inflate that a little bit.
Right. No, that makes total sense. And actually, I mean, I spend a lot of time denigrating the way that scientists report their data and some, in many cases, conduct it. But that's really the best that you can do when it comes to establishing things like that. That is the best you can do. And I understand why they would inflate it 10 to 15% just as a just in case. Although you got to be careful with that because we know with things like vitamin C, if you get too much of it, that can actually be a problem for people. Because it's converted into three different things, I think, but all of them are, suffix with alate. The oxalate is one of them. And we know that those are problems when it comes to the formation of raphides and stuff like that. So that is the best they can do. So basically, what I tell people is whenever I mean, to go back to the first question, the root of this, which is, what would I respond to people with whenever they say that you'll become deficient on these micronutrients, because simply based on the amount that's contained within, let's say, a cut of meat. Usually they pick like steak, for example, or something. Well, what I say is, since it's already difficult alone, it's very ambiguous when it comes to how much of a nutrient that people require. Also, how much of your body retains onto or stores onto one nutrient and then as you keep eating, you fill up your stores, so to speak. You know, um, since it's so conditional, what I say is the best way to tell if someone is nutrient deficient is based on symptomology. Like, are you actually experiencing symptoms when you are eating this food? Are you lethargic? Are you experiencing, and we know that some people in the carnivore space experience things like, at least in the beginning, especially, is like palpitations or sleep disturbances that are related around muscle soreness or like cramping or stuff like that. And then you know that it's probably electrolyte based, or you're not consuming enough protein, which is also related to that as well, though, because of insulin and stuff. And so I think that the best way, I know that a lot of people may think that's a very convenient way out of the argument is, well, are you deficient or sorry, are you symptomatic or are you not? But it's simply because it's so difficult to actually establish your personal nutrient threshold. And also, therefore, in ways, just based on what I just said, where if you consume a little bit of a vitamin, depending on your physiological system status in terms of its health, that will also determine how much of it will store onto said nutrient, um, for you to continue building up those stores, like with future meals.
Yeah.
That matters too. And so, since it's conditional on so many levels,
Yeah,
you
and
have
I
to
can
look
I can tell a story of one of my clients that sort of backs this up. It's a weird story, and I hesitate to tell it because obviously this is not medical advice. But so a client who, based on her blood work, she had a clinical iron deficiency, but she didn't have any symptoms.
right.
So for me, my first, I'm not, I'm not a doctor. I can't prescribe medical treatments, but I was like, chicken livers have a lot of iron, and we've addressed iron deficiencies with chicken livers before. So why don't you have some of that? She was having it. She was feeling great. Again, no symptoms, but got retested. Still, it's below whatever the minimum level was, and she couldn't tolerate supplements. So different options, and in the carnivore space and also in the biohacking space, I think people want to be in the optimum range almost for confirmation bias.
Yep.
And so she decided to get the iron infusions. And after the iron infusions, that's when her symptoms came, and they came with a vengeance. It's been like 6 weeks and she still doesn't feel back to normal. So, I mean, just to be careful when you're playing around with this stuff, it can have, Hippocrates had a point, right? Like, first, do no harm is actually really good advice.
Yep.
And if you don't have symptoms, maybe think twice before getting a treatment to address what's just a blood work number.
Yep, and most of them, once again, as trite as this is, they're based on normative levels of the population, like we just said, and like the current population is not very healthy. And whenever those values were actually established, the population even then didn't seem to be healthy when you look at the patterns of behavior back then. So, I mean, there was still, you're eating a very sugar-heavy diet with a bunch of other things as well, like meat, and we know that mixing carbs and fat doesn't seem to be, it seems to be even worse than, in many ways, than consuming one or the other exclusively. So,
Yeah, I mean, this is where it gets a little bit tricky for me as an anthropologist, because my take is that all of our food cultures evolved in the context of scarcity, manufactured
yeah,
scarcity largely, so that the ruling classes, however you want to define that term, could basically, have slaves who were fed enough to actually work for them, but not so sharp to the point where they would revolt, right? So, I mean,
right.
I'm oversimplifying a lot of things, but that's kind of what it boils down to at a certain level. So, in order to do that, what it may be the case that moving from a meat-based diet to a grain-based diet changed human physiology, or there are some adaptations. Actually, we know that it's the case. There are some adaptations that
Mhm.
happen, and therefore extrapolating blood work from that population, which is everyone between 10,000 years ago and like the 1960s, pretty much. Not everyone, but a huge percentage of the population. Extrapolating data from that and saying
Yeah.
it's normal for all humans, I don't know. Can we do that?
Yeah, I don't think that that's a good idea, and that's where, once again, my end conclusion is: are you actually symptomatic? That is always going to be like, always go back to what you just said. The Hippocrates, where he says, "First, do no harm." I mean, it may appear, and that's why I've said in my videos before, when with respect to like things like cholesterol levels, especially, which people are very vexed about a lot, including me originally. Even whenever I learned all the lies surrounding cholesterol and also the truth about it, it took me a good year to actually get my brain out of the whole propaganda, like the voice in the back of my head going, "Oh man, maybe I should drain my fat a little bit when I make my food." It's really hard to get out of that when you're taught that for, I mean, ever since I was sentient. But with cholesterol levels, for example, when it comes to assessing them on a normative level basis, that's not a good idea first and foremost, especially when you look at the fact that, cholesterol really doesn't have any significance in the heart disease process. But I mean, I actually sort of forgot where I was going because I sort of trailed off.
No, no.
But
So, so the point being that can you extrapolate? So let's. I mean, here I want to bring in. I actually want to talk about cholesterol because there is some data that's
Mhm.
come out. I don't know if you've been following the whole Dave Feldman data drops and so on. So he dropped. There's the official paper that came out from that team a couple weeks ago. But the week before that official paper, they dropped some unofficial data, which I found really fascinating. I don't know if you had a chance to look at that unofficial data, but it was like what the chart that and maybe I'll put it in the edit here. The chart that was the most interesting to me was that in the low carb, high fat sort of keto population, there was no correlation at all between LDL and heart disease, and not heart disease, plaque progression. That's what we're measuring here.
Mhm.
So zero, like there was no correlation at
Right.
all. But in the mainstream Miami heart population, there actually was not a statistically significant correlation, but almost. I think the p-value was 0.6, not 0.5.
Okay. Okay.
So getting close to statistical significance. I don't know if that counts for anything,
Hmm.
but um, but the point being that maybe it's the case that LDL. So LDL has nothing to do with the pathophysiology of heart disease, as you know and as I know. However, maybe it's the case that it is a good surrogate marker in some subset of the population that is eating a sugar-based diet. Maybe. I don't even think there's enough data to say that, but
I know.
maybe.
I think even if it is, I think there's better markers, but I think you're right because you have to. I mean, when you really look at like how LDL functions in the body and what its significance is in like pathways and stuff like that, metabolic pathways, you realize that LDL is something that just administers cholesterol to many tissues of the body for either like sex hormone synthesis or most importantly, the healing of tissues. And so, in populations that are sustaining a lot of injury, perhaps their LDL will go up because of to compensate for that increased damage that they're sustaining. So that's why I say LDL is probably conditional, which would explain why different subsets you'll find a different association in terms of LDL and cardiovascular disease outcomes, for example.
Yeah, and there's a third thing that you didn't mention, which is that LDL or VLDL is theoretically, according to this, to Dave's hypothesis, whose name I'm currently forgetting, but it's part of the energy system. It's part of trafficking
Mhm.
triglycerides
Yep.
to actually serve the process of getting fat to mitochondria for oxidation
Hmm.
to create ATP. And in a population that's using it for energy, well, it's not really correlated with immune function at all. But in a population that's not using it for energy, because they're replete with glucose, exogenous glucose, which is contraindicated, as you might say, um, in that population, maybe it is a marker for inflammation and for activation of these various pathways and so on.
Yeah, that's a good point too, because yeah, VLDL, depending on the hormonal status of the body, it's going to be doing different things. VLDL is a lipoprotein involved in lipoprotein metabolism. It's this whole like cyclic pathway. It starts with chylomicrons, then it goes to VLDL and stuff like that. Well, VLDL is what is the sort of first intermediary, but after chylomicrons in that pathway, and so it carries a lot of triglycerides. It's mainly triglycerides. It carries very little cholesterol, and so depending on the hormonal status of the body, that will determine how much of the VLDL will administer the triglycerides into fat cells via lipoprotein lipase or whatever, breaking it down, versus how much of it will versus how much of the LDL or the VLDL rather will um, deliver it to, let's say, muscle cells for oxidation. The fats in it for oxidation. That
Sure.
is one of the things that people. So again, these levels are conditional depending on the context. They are contextual. That's probably the better word to use. So I think probably LEL is the same way. I'm not sure. I have to look into how. Well, that's the thing. I don't. LDL isn't typically measured. It's actually estimated.
It's
So
a calculate. Yeah.
it's a calculation. So I don't
Yeah.
know.
So I had a long discussion with Dave Feldman on this channel. It'll be, I think it's 3 episodes prior to this one if you're watching this one. 3 or 4 episodes, I can't remember offhand. But if you check out that discussion, the point where Dave was sort of, he wasn't stumped, but he admitted it's something that he doesn't really have a good answer for, but it's worth exploring. Is so if you're eating fat, your body's going to have to get that fat to the muscles and to the tissues that need it, right? And
Mhm.
the vehicle that it needs to do that is the VLDL, which is made in the liver. There are also chylomicrons, which come from the gut and can also turn into VLDL, but let's focus on the liver for right now. So you're making VLDL at the liver, and that's delivered to the whatever cell you want, hepatic cell, muscle cell, whatever, and will shrink and go from a VLDL because it's losing its triglyceride burden, losing some of its outer shell stuff as well. Sorry, I'm forgetting the technical terms.
Mhm.
Um, the phospholipid bilayer,
Yeah.
and therefore is being converted from a VLDL to an LDL. Now the question then becomes, once it's done that job, why doesn't the LDL just get taken back up by the liver? Why does the LDL stick around for? Chylomicrons are only there for hours. VLDL is there for at most a day.
Right.
Um, LDL, we're talking more like 3 to 5 days or 5 to 7 days. I'm forgetting the exact lifetime, but it's a lot longer. So the question then becomes why, and where Dave was hinting, he didn't want to say it as directly as I'm going to say it, but where he was hinting at was, we have data to say that the LDL is actually functioning as part of the immune system, and therefore, if the liver decides not to take it up at a certain point and to take it up only 48 hours later, maybe it's playing an important role. And I don't, in fairness, I don't think we have a good answer to that, but that's a decent hypothesis. That sounds like a good working hypothesis for now.
Yeah, I think so. I've seen. I don't know about the lifetime either for LDL existing in the bloodstream before the liver takes it back up. My question would be, I mean, it's sort of a rhetorical because I'm going to give feedback as to what I think the answer is to this question. But how much of the LDL is remaining in the let's say the bloodstream before it's taken up by the liver? How much of it is staying in there because the liver is deciding not to take it up? Versus how much of it is due to the fact that it does not recognize the receptors on the outside of LDL because it's being oxidized or glycated in the bloodstream. Because that will prevent the liver from taking it up because now the body recognizes those proteins as foreign. What we know is that since LDL is, like you said, it's part of the immune system effectively because it's administering cholesterol to damaged tissues, for example, that when you have damage like lesioning to the arterial lining, LDL can, well, the proteoglycans of the cells will take up those LDL particles and will keep them there to pump out the cholesterol out of the lipoprotein. However, if that injury is not healing fully, then those LDL particles can stay there even longer. And if it stays there longer, since it's in the arterial side that you see most of this damage occurring anyway, that's where oxygenated blood is. And then it can be oxidized, so deranged, causing the immune system to recognize it as a foreign protein, launching even more inflammation on the area. So then it's a
Yeah,
feedback loop again. And then not only oxidation, but glycation can occur as well if you are eating a lot of carbohydrates.
for sure.
Hyperglycemia will do it. And so that's what my sort of rhetorical question is: how much of the LDL particles are remaining in the bloodstream because they're actually serving that purpose of repairing the lining of the arteries, for example, versus how much of the liver is not even recognizing them as LDL particles anymore, or the body at least, because they're deranged from things like oxidation and glycation.
Yeah. I mean, as a counterpoint to this, I think people like myself, so I'm very much, I think my LDL is somewhere around 400 last I checked, maybe
Okay.
slightly less now, 350. So it's very, very high. And I think if you tested my ox LDL, I think you're also going to see that it's elevated. But the ratio of ox LDL to the total LDL will be, because I have so much LDL, it's actually going to be pretty low ratio.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Again, these are measures that are imperfect measures at the very best. But my sense is that you would see if you just measured oxidized LDL particles in my body, it would be more than the average number of particles in a
Hmm.
non hyperresponder's body. But if you compare it as a percentage, it would actually be less. And I think that may be
Yeah.
more significant than other things. I don't know. Now I'm really making stuff up because we don't really have data to demonstrate this stuff. At the end of the day, what I want to I just want the null hypothesis should be that all this the body's not trying to kill you. The idea
Right.
that the
Right.
body is making my LDL 400 so for the express purposes of putting those LDL particles in my in the arteries of my heart to give me a heart
Right.
attack at age 50 or something. That's a very silly hypothesis.
I've yeah.
Like I see, and the Dr. Allos of the world and whoever are advancing that hypothesis, and I
Yeah.
think that's just stupid.
Yeah, no, I very recently I saw your comment on my Alo video actually, and that video. So if you watched it, you'll have seen that I actually said that I was like, when it comes to, let's say the LDL, let's say that Alo was right, the LDL levels as they increase, your risk of mortality increases. Well, Alo is still saying that you should therefore give someone a drug like a statin to lower that level. But you have to understand, when you just learn basic physiology, that LDL is a lipoprotein that is encoded for, its production is encoded for by genes in your body, which means that it's producing it for a reason, which means that if your level is quote unquote elevated, which is just a term to represent that it's elevated above a normative level, and we already talked about that, but let's just, yeah, it's elevated. That means that the body deems it appropriate to have it be that level. So even if LDL were causal in heart disease in any way, you can't say that the best method of action to employ to get that level down is by giving someone a drug, which, by the way, is very harmful in terms of its chemistry on the body. You would have to at least, at the very least, say, okay, change your diet or something, right? But even then, LDL, when you look at the mechanisms, is not a causal factor in heart disease, really. You have to first have damage to the arteries for LDL to even play a contributing role by, for example, remaining in the walls of the artery and then becoming oxidized and then launching inflammation, for example, and then causing even more layers to occur, you know. But yeah, it doesn't make any sense why, once again, like you said, your body's not going to encode for the production of a protein that's going to kill you. It's doing it for a reason. Your genes do that for a reason, a good reason.
Yeah, and I think the only people who could hypothesize that the body produces a molecule that's designed to kill you are people who are looking at people who want to, what's the word? It's confirmation bias. They have a hypothesis, they want to prove it. And their hypothesis, going back to Ansel Keys and all that stuff, was that saturated fat was a problem. I mean, all these things. Every single piece of the hypothesis has been disproven over the years.
Yep.
But still, I mean, I had a session. My physician and I have I wouldn't say a love-hate relationship, but kind of an interesting relationship. I go there to get blood work, mostly to share with my followers. I don't really care about my numbers so much because, as you say, I have no symptoms, right? But he's seen my success over the years, and now he wants to be my client. So I had my first session with him today, right? And still, his when I tell him that maybe you should replace that seed oil with butter, like his instinct is no, that doesn't make any sense. I've been told to avoid saturated fat. Butter is saturated fat. So still, even
Yep.
today, we have the people who are taking the various chains of that hypothesis and stating them as if they're a gospel. People with authority.
Yep.
And unfortunately, I would just encourage everyone, if you're hearing this and you're saying that any of this doesn't make much sense and LDL does cause heart disease, just look into that whole hypothesis and the history of it and how it's been really disproven year after year. There's a number of good books on this. I'm sure Eddie's book would also be good. I haven't had a chance to read that yet, Eddie. But the one that I use is Malcolm Kendrick's book, The Clot Thickens, which is a really good starting point for those who want to explore this further.
Yeah, I agree. The thing that you just talked about with the hypothesis, where it's confirmation bias. I mean, when you learn, I mean, it's one of the first things you learn, even when you're not a scientist, is scientists will formulate a hypothesis, that being the null hypothesis, and what their job is to disprove it with everything they got. Like, no matter how much, you have to separate your feelings from it. I mean, being a genuine, bona fide, responsible scientist takes a lot of humility for that reason. You have to put aside your preconceived notions of anything, your beliefs on the topic, and you have to say, okay, well, let's just look at what the data shows, and let's also, if it doesn't disprove the hypothesis, let's go even further and try and test it even further. Like, you try to disprove it, you are trying to absolutely eviscerate that hypothesis, and if it holds up after all of those rigorous standards that you just applied, well, then you can be pretty confident in your stance that perhaps that this is actually the truth. You still can't be definitive that that's causal, that that's absolutely true, but you can
Yeah.
say that there's no evidence to refute that, so to speak. But no scientists do that nowadays, it seems. No one.
Well, I mean, mathematicians and physicists would probably still employ that kind of rigor. But the fact that no one in the mainstream, or hardly anyone in the mainstream lipidology and cardiology world, is even talking about Norwitz and Feldman and Adrian Sotomoto's their little team, because it's fascinating work. I mean, studying a population that, if you think LDL is causal, is causally associated with heart disease, or is part of the causal pathway, or whatever you want to say it, then you should see elevated heart disease in populations with high LDL and no other risk factors. So this is the experiment that could prove your hypothesis. And yet the people who are the biggest promoters of that hypothesis seem the least interested in this research. So it's really for me, that whole world has been eye-opening in the sense where, because I used to be, I myself consider myself a scientist. Okay, I'm a social scientist, but I have a respect for science. My brother is a PhD in microbiology. I have a real respect for scientists. But since I've gotten into this field, I don't know, man. It feels like no one's really doing the kind of hypothesis disproving science that would be necessary to actually say anything concrete about the human body. So
Yeah.
we're left with my work as a historian and an anthropologist, which is okay. But I wish it was. I honestly wish the state of the science was much stronger than it is.
Yeah. No, I think I've said this on my channel before. I think a lot of it actually isn't to do with the scientists themselves in many cases. They're trying to get publications out because it's many of the journals themselves, the people that run the journals that are the problem. Because I mean, for example, when you talk about epidemiological journals, a lot of people don't realize that it's actually, as a scientist, as an epidemiologist, you are unable to publish or get science studies that you've conducted published in epidemiological journals that disprove your hypothesis within them. It's publication bias. That's what that is. So if you conduct a study and 11 times it disproves your hypothesis, but there's three that seem to prove it, well then they'll take those three. And as a
Yeah.
scientist, you're trying to get publicized. You're trying to get your name in there, to get to make a living as a scientist, right? And so you have this pressure on scientists to actually do these things that are irresponsible to get their name out there. The scientific journals seem to be the biggest problem, not the scientists themselves.
Yeah, I agree. Although, when I hear someone like Dayspring, Thomas Dayspring talk, so you mentioned Dayspring in your Aloe video. I would recommend that you check out some of his interviews, or maybe read some of his stuff. He is so it's not that he doesn't have good science to contribute. He understands more about lipids than probably anyone else,
Hmm.
but I'm not sure what the point of knowing that much about lipids is when when they're not causally associated,
Right,
or they don't cause heart disease, right? Which is his starting point. He
right.
doesn't prove that. That's his starting point, and then he goes on to talk about, so things like the lifespan of an LDL molecule, like he knows off the top of his head, right? So it's worth engaging with that stuff, but it's like only to a point, because you can only prove things, or you can only examine things within the framework that you're using, and the framework that he's using is so totally wrong.
Yep.
On the other hand, there are the people who trained him. So Bill Cromwell is someone who trained that guy, and he's involved with he's doing one of the studies. I forget which study he's involved with, but again with that Feldman team. So there's some people, as you say, who are more open to this discussion. But in general, I think there's also a prestige issue. Like, that guy has enough prestige where he could literally change the lipid heart hypothesis overnight if he wanted to, just by saying something different. And it sounds like he's about to. Sounds like he's about to say, no, in the context of people who don't have other markers, maybe LDL is not an important marker to look at, which would be a step forward.
That would be a step forward for sure. Yeah.
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 Eddie, it's been a real pleasure chatting with you. I wonder, in the last 5 minutes, um, I wonder if we could chat about something that comes up a lot, which is, I get accused, and I imagine you get accused sometimes, of being too puritanical, too much of a purist. The
Yeah.
carnivore diet is too restrictive. What do you have to say to this particular? In other words, we agree. We agree that everything you're saying is true in terms of what's indicated and what's not indicated, but it's too hard. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, I have two things to say. So the first one that I'll say is a pretty, once again, it's a trite response, which is okay. Well, I'll tell you what's actually restrictive. Being completely debilitated with things like diabetes or heart disease or dementia later on in life, brain fog, joint pain, arthritis, all that stuff, gastrointestinal disorders, all of those being directly caused by your inappropriate diet for your physiology. That's truly restrictive. People that tend to say, well, that's really restrictive, what I really think in the back of my head is, okay, well, wait until you're like 40 or something and you have the same issues that every other 40-year-old, at least the majority of them, have that are directly related to your diet. And let's see if you actually put two and two together, because that's the other step, right? So that's the first thing that I say. It's not restrictive when you've actually been restricted, like really restricted, right? It's liberating. It is actually liberating. And it goes back to the very archaic point where it's like, being able to do anything whenever you want is not liberating. You're a slave to your own desires. I mean, that's really what it is. So, and also, this belief that the less rules you have, the more free you are. And it's like, that's like, I heard an analogy a long time ago where if that's the case, well, then imagine that we're playing a game, right? And I'm player one, you're player two, and then you agree to play the game, and I go, okay, well, your turn. Well, you don't know how to act. What do you? There's no rules, so it's not truly liberating to not have any rules and to not have any restrictions. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing is a lot of people. I deal with this on my channel a lot. A lot of people tend to think that the carnivore diet is eating a ribeye a day, every day, forever, with nothing else. Well, that's not true, and it's not even the case that you have to necessarily only eat meat, although that's also not really that restrictive in my opinion because there's so many different kinds of meat and so many different cuts of a certain animal. Beef is a perfect example of that, but then you've got other things like fish that I think that it's totally fine to have wild caught fish once in a while. Especially, I think that also you can have even more depending on where you are because of where it's sourced. Things like pork, things like chicken, and then but also dairy if it's not a problem for you. I typically say on my channel, and I get a lot of flack for it because I'm like a lot of people think of me as a figure in the exclusively the carnivore space, so therefore they expect me to be a huge fan of dairy. My experience and also just other people's experiences, I don't think that dairy is the absolute best thing, but it's carnivore, and so it's bereft of a lot of plant toxins, like all of them. And so if people fare well with it, then that's also something that you could experiment with, even if it's just a slight amount. Spices are plants, but some people don't have a problem with those, and
Yeah.
I've never been a person to say that you have to be completely so puritanical to the point where you can't even have like a speck of black pepper once in a while if you want to. And so that's the other point I'd add. Even if you are going to use the common belief that a diet that eliminates most things that people consider food and therefore also eat ubiquitously is restrictive, it's even using that definition, carnivore diet is not that restrictive. And there's even more people like Courtney Luna you've probably heard of before. Everyone seems, she's a very popular, health influencer in the carnivore space that focuses on making recipes that are carnivore. Bella from Steak and Butter Gal is very similar in that respect. There's other recipes coming out. The more that you popularize that diet, the more people are going to actually experiment with it and then get more recipes out there as well if you want to experiment with just the same ingredients you've been eating all the time. So that's what I'd say in response to that.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. I mean, just to add to that, I just because we know something is contraindicated or whatever it may be, doesn't mean I'm telling you what to do, right? Like,
Right,
I mean,
exactly. Yeah.
no one thinks smoking is good for you, but if you want to have a cigarette, I'm not going to stop you. Like, it's your business, right?
Exactly.
But I just think that it's important. So I was watching an interview with someone else in the space whose name I'm forgetting, but it's a really nice interview. She's an older lady in Canada, very, very intelligent. And what she was saying was, I made my kids eat vegetables even though they didn't want to, and eventually they became carb addicts, even though that was not their propensity. They never would have
Right.
ended up
Yeah.
that way if I hadn't forced vegetables down their throat. And so, we know smoking isn't good. But if an adult wants to smoke, it's their business. But we don't give it to kids, right?
Right.
We know drinking isn't good, but again, if an adult wants to drink, it's their business. We don't give it to kids. So if people just understand that vegetables are 99 times out of 100, not a great idea, not contraindicated, not particularly healthy, going to cause inflammation, that carbs are going to, as you say, glucose is an actual toxin physiologically.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm forgetting the term. You'll remind me?
As to what glucose is, it's an aldehyde. It's an
It's
aldohexose. Yes. Yeah.
aldohexose. That's the word,
Yeah.
aldohexose. So if you understand that, then it's not to say that you never eat a food with glucose in it. It's just that you know that it's toxic. So you moderate your intake of it or whatever. However, your relationship with that food is up to you. But you have to know where it stands on the spectrum of what's indicated and what's not. Does that make
Yep.
sense?
Yep. That's what I say all the time. I don't pretend like I say things like indicated and contraindicated. That's the terminology, or
Yeah.
appropriate and inappropriate. That's a good replacement. But the thing is, you know, I say that carbs are, for example, not indicated, but just 2 days ago I had about 10 grams. But I'm not going to pretend like I'm not going to go on YouTube and then say, well, therefore 10 grams is probably what you should be consuming. And like, it's like I see people do that all the time where it's like,
Yeah.
okay, I seem to need about, I have a friend that seems to need, whenever he's on carnivore, he has extreme migraines. And the only time, we've tried everything, the only thing that gets him to stop is if he has like 10 grams of carbs a day. And I said, okay, well, there you
That's what it
go.
is.
I have 10 grams. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and go, you know, that's always necessarily every single person should be having 0 grams. I usually say that, the closest you can get to 0 grams, it's feasible while responsibly trying to transition towards said value. is indicated. But if you don't want to, if you want to have like 10 grams and you can control yourself, that's your decision. And I mean, that's on you, therefore. So, yeah.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's always your decision, and the question is,
Hmm.
to what extent do you want to prioritize? Do you need to prioritize your health at this given moment in time?
Yeah.
And like again, I have clients who still struggle with drugs of abuse and that kind of stuff. Again, no judgment here. This is the world we live in. But they don't pretend that crystal meth or whatever is healthy. Like
Right.
no one thinks that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Whereas people think that I don't know, broccoli is, for example, or whatever. So some food for thought. Eddie Goki, it's been a real pleasure. How can people find you on the internet aside from your YouTube, which I'll tag you in the title here? But where else can people find you?
Yeah, so well, yeah, I'm primarily active on YouTube, but I've also been, and I need to be a little more vocal about this. I forget that I have it. I've tried to be more active on X, formerly known as Twitter, with my uploads, just in case something like my channel gets flagged or something like that. I'm trying to get people to move over to Twitter or X as well because my uploads are on there. So that is Goki Eddie, at Goki Eddie, just my name flipped around. And then, by the way, Goki is Goeke for people that are wondering. It's Goeke. And then if people want to reach me through like direct messaging, I'm not active on Instagram in terms of posting, but in terms of messaging, I am. So that is e.goki_ on Instagram. And then my email, if people want to email me, that's edgoki14@gmail.com. Those are my primary platforms that I'm on right now. Yep.
Cool. And I'll put all those links in the notes below.
Good.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much, man. It's been a pleasure. Hope we can do this again sometime.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on again.
Thanks for listening to my discussion with Eddie Goki. For more content like this, please check out my website, samirdosani.net. If you're interested in the nutraceutical stem cell supporting product that both Eddie and I take, check out samir.cerule.com. That's samir.cerule.com. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next one.